The scorching sun bore down on the bustling freeway, where traffic moved like a sluggish serpent during the late afternoon rush hour. His silver-streaked hair was immaculately combed, his piercing blue eyes shielded by designer sunglasses. As he tapped his fingers on the steering wheel, his mind wandered to the weight of decades of experiences, the kind that shaped a man but left deep scars. The monotonous crawl of cars was suddenly shattered by the screech of tires. John turned his head just in time to see a silver sedan spin wildly out of control. The vehicle twisted as though defying physics, glass shattering into thousands of glittering fragments. Metal screeched like a tortured beast as the car landed upside down with a deafening crash. Smoke began to curl from the crumpled hood, ominous and suffocating in the sweltering heat. Instinctively, John reached for his phone to dial 911. But before he could even press the button, movement from the crowd caught his eye. A young man, probably no older than his late 20s, emerged from the throng of stunned onlookers. His appearance was unremarkable. Faded jeans, a plain mechanic's work shirt, but his actions were anything but ordinary. Without hesitation, he sprinted toward the smoking vehicle, dodging debris with the agility of a trained athlete. Time seemed to slow as John watched, transfixed. The young man reached the overturned car, pulling at the mangled door with a strength that belied his lean frame. The metal groaned and resisted, but his determination was unyielding. With a final pull, the door gave way. First, he reached inside and extracted a boy, no older than 7, cradling him protectively as he carried him to safety. The boy was dazed but unharmed, his wide eyes filled with terror. John's breath caught in his throat as the young man turned back to the car. Flames licked at the edges of the crumpled hood, but he seemed oblivious to the danger. With careful precision, he reached inside again, this time pulling out a woman who appeared unconscious. Her face was pale, her long hair matted with blood, but she was alive. Gently, he laid her on the ground beside the boy, shielding them both from the growing inferno. Seconds later, the car erupted into flames, a thunderous roar that sent the crowd stumbling backward. The young man, however, simply stepped away, his face calm, his breathing heavy but controlled. He didn't stay to bask in the admiration of the crowd or to explain himself. Instead, he disappeared into the anonymity of the gathering onlookers, as if his act of heroism was nothing more than a routine part of his day. John couldn't move. His mind raced, not just with the drama unfolding before him, but with an inexplicable sense of connection to the young man. There was something in his movements, his focus, his refusal of recognition that resonated deeply. It wasn't just admiration, this was personal, though he couldn't quite place why. As paramedics rushed to the scene and the crowd began to disperse, John remained in his car, staring at the smoldering wreckage. For the first time in years, he felt a spark, something raw and urgent. He didn't know it yet, but this moment would unravel a story that had been waiting 3 decades to surface. The freeway accident had shaken John in ways he hadn't anticipated. Days later, he sat in his expansive home office, the faint hum of the city below barely registering in his mind. The room was a testament to his success. Shelves lined with awards, books on business strategy, and carefully curated artifacts from decades of global travels. Yet, none of it held his attention now. Instead, his thoughts were consumed by the image of the young man who had risked everything to save strangers. There was something hauntingly familiar about him, not just in his selflessness, but in the precision and determination of his movements. It gnawed at John, a feeling he couldn't explain but couldn't ignore. He leaned back in his chair, his fingers tapping rhythmically on the polished mahogany desk. Finally, he reached for his phone and dialed a number he hadn't used in years. Miguel answered on the second ring, his gravelly voice unmistakable. "John, it's been a while." "It has," John replied, his tone measured but laced with urgency. "I need your help." Miguel had a reputation for solving problems that others couldn't. He was a private investigator who thrived on discretion and results, a man John had trusted to navigate complex business dealings when billions were at stake. This, however, was different. Business or personal? Miguel asked, his tone shifting slightly. Deeply personal, John admitted, the weight of his words hanging in the air. I need you to find someone. A young man, late 20s, works as a mechanic. He was involved in a rescue on the freeway last week. Miguel didn't ask for details. He never did. Instead, he agreed to meet John in person, setting the rendezvous at a secluded cafe on the outskirts of the city. When they met, Miguel's weathered face betrayed no surprise at John's request, though his raised eyebrow hinted at curiosity. As John recounted the events, Miguel listened intently, jotting down notes with the same meticulousness he brought to every case. It's a long shot, Miguel said finally, his tone neutral. But if he left any trace, license plates, surveillance cameras, I'll find him. John nodded, knowing Miguel's reputation was built on delivering results. Days passed in a restless haze as John awaited news. When Miguel finally called, his voice carried the faintest edge of triumph. I've got something, Miguel began. Traffic cameras caught a nearby work van. The plate matches a local mechanic shop. The young man's name is Daniel. The name hit John like a jolt, stirring memories he'd buried long ago. He hadn't thought about Elena in years, but suddenly, her face came rushing back. Her laughter, her fierce independence, and the last night they'd spent together. Their love fractured by the inevitability of his departure. Miguel continued, unaware of the emotional storm brewing in John's mind. Daniel works at a small family-owned garage. Modest place, tucked in a working-class neighborhood. From what I've seen, he's there from dawn till dusk, 6 days a week. Hard worker, doesn't draw attention to himself. John thanked Miguel and ended the call, but his thoughts spiraled. Was it possible? Could this young man, this stranger whose courage had captivated him, be connected to his past? He needed to see for himself. The next morning, John drove to the address Miguel provided. The garage was a stark contrast to the sleek, modern buildings John was accustomed to. Its chipped paint and weathered sign spoke of decades of service, a place that survived on grit and loyalty rather than polish. From the comfort of his luxury car, John watched as Daniel moved between vehicles, his hands covered in grease, but his actions precise and deliberate. There was a quiet intensity to him, an unspoken dedication that reminded John of his own beginnings. As the hours passed, John's observations revealed more than just skill. Daniel took time with each customer, explaining repairs in layman's terms, offering solutions that prioritized their needs over profit. When an elderly man struggled to pay for a repair, Daniel waved it off with a smile, telling him to pay when you can. For the first time in years, John felt something stir deep within, a sense of connection, of purpose, as if fate was nudging him toward a truth he wasn't ready to face. He didn't approach Daniel that day, but he knew this was only the beginning. The young man held answers John didn't even know he was seeking, and he was determined to uncover them. John couldn't stay away. The following days saw him return to the small garage, always watching from the safety of his car. He was careful not to linger too long or draw attention, but his curiosity about Daniel grew with each passing moment. There was a magnetic pull, an unshakable feeling that this young man was more than just an echo of his past. On one particularly crisp morning, John parked in the same discreet spot. The sun cast long shadows across the street, and the sound of clinking tools and muted conversation drifted from the garage. As he observed Daniel, a scene unfolded that gripped him. An older woman arrived in a car that looked like it had survived multiple eras. Its faded paint and rattling engine spoke of years of neglect. She stepped out cautiously, holding a small bag of groceries. Her face was lined with age, her movements slow but deliberate. Daniel greeted her warmly, his voice carrying across the lot. "Morning, Mrs. Bennett. What seems to be the trouble?" The woman sighed, embarrassed. "It's the same thing as last time, I think. It keeps stalling, but I'm afraid it might be more serious this time." Daniel nodded, his expression compassionate. "Don't worry, we'll sort it out." John watched as Daniel spent hours inspecting the vehicle. He replaced parts, tested the engine, and even cleaned the interior. When Mrs. Bennett returned, she offered him a small wad of cash, apologizing profusely for not being able to pay more. Daniel smiled, shaking his head. "You keep that for yourself, ma'am. Just make sure you drive safe, all right?" The woman's eyes welled up with tears. "I don't know what I'd do without you, Daniel." As Daniel helped her load groceries into the trunk, John felt his chest tighten. The scene was a mirror of his own past. How he had once sacrificed for others before wealth had dulled the edges of his compassion. Daniel's humility and kindness weren't just admirable, they were a reminder of who John used to be. John's reverie was broken by a sudden knock on his car window. Startled, he turned to see Miguel standing there, his face a mixture of amusement and concern. "Planning to stay in here all day?" Miguel quipped as John rolled down the window. "I wasn't ready to approach him," John admitted, gesturing toward Daniel. "I needed to see more." Miguel leaned against the car, his tone softening. "You've seen it. The kid's a good man. So, what now?" John hesitated. "I don't know. There's something about him. Something I can't ignore." Miguel raised an eyebrow. "You're not just looking for answers, John. You're looking for redemption." The words hit like a hammer. John had spent decades burying the pain of his past, telling himself that his success had come at a necessary cost. But now, watching Daniel, he felt the cracks in that carefully constructed narrative widening. "Keep looking into him," John finally said, his voice firm. "I need to know more." Miguel nodded and walked away, leaving John alone with his thoughts. That night, back in the solitude of his home library, John pulled out a weathered shoebox. Inside were remnants of a life he had tried to forget. Letters, photographs, small tokens of love. He sifted through them slowly until he found a picture of Elena. Her smile was as radiant as he remembered, but it was her eyes that held him captive. They had been full of dreams, of belief in a future they would build together. He traced his fingers over the image, the weight of regret pressing down on him. Could it really be? He whispered to the empty room. The next day, armed with determination, John decided to take the first step. He drove to the garage, parking closer than usual. As he stepped out of his car, he caught sight of Daniel working beneath the hood of a car. John took a deep breath and walked toward him, his heart pounding with a mix of fear and hope. "Excuse me," John called out, his voice steady despite the storm inside him. Daniel straightened, wiping his hands on a rag. "Can I help you?" John hesitated, then extended his hand. "I think you can. I'm John." Daniel shook his hand, his grip firm but unassuming. "Daniel, what brings you here?" John glanced at the cars around them, his mind racing for the right words. "I've been looking for someone, and I think it might be you." Daniel's brow furrowed, confusion and curiosity flickering in his eyes. "I'm not sure I follow." John's voice softened. "I'd like to talk, if you'll let me. I think there's more to this than either of us realizes." Daniel's confusion lingered as he gestured for John to follow him to a quieter area of the garage. The din of clanking tools and revving engines faded as they moved toward a small office tucked in the corner of the lot. It was modest. A desk, a couple of chairs, and walls adorned with faded posters of classic cars. Daniel leaned against the desk, crossing his arms as he studied John. "So," Daniel began, his tone cautious but polite. "What's this about?" John hesitated, the words catching in his throat. He had rehearsed this moment countless times, but now, standing in front of Daniel, everything felt uncertain. He removed his sunglasses, revealing the depth of his piercing blue eyes. "I saw what you did on the freeway," John started, his voice steady but tinged with emotion. "That was extraordinary. You saved those people." Daniel shrugged, clearly uncomfortable with the attention. "Anyone would have done the same." "No," John countered firmly, his gaze locking onto Daniel's. "Not anyone. You didn't hesitate, didn't even think about yourself." That kind of courage is rare. Daniel rubbed the back of his neck, his discomfort growing. I don't really see how this connects to you. John took a deep breath, deciding to lay a piece of the truth bare. You remind me of someone I used to know. Someone I cared about a long time ago. Daniel's expression softened slightly, curiosity replacing his guarded demeanor. Who? John hesitated again, the weight of his memories pressing down on him. Her name was Elena. We were close many years ago. At the mention of her name, Daniel froze. His eyes widened and he straightened, the name clearly striking a chord. Elena? Yes, John replied, his voice now quieter. I don't know if it's a coincidence, but you remind me of her. The way you move, the way you carry yourself. It's uncanny. Daniel stared at him for a moment, then turned abruptly toward a small cabinet against the wall. He rummaged through the drawers, his movements hurried but deliberate. Finally, he pulled out a worn envelope and handed it to John. Inside was a photograph. John's breath hitched as he stared at it. The image showed Elena, her face as radiant as he remembered, but it wasn't just her. She was pregnant, her hands resting protectively on her swollen belly, her smile a mix of joy and quiet determination. This is my mother, Daniel said, his voice steady but filled with unspoken questions. She passed away when I was 10. My grandparents raised me after that. I never knew much about my father. She never talked about him. John's hands trembled as he held the photograph, his mind racing. Memories flooded back, the nights he and Elena had spent dreaming of a future that life had cruelly ripped away. The last time he'd seen her, she had been strong, defiant, and so certain of their love. I never knew, John murmured, his voice cracking. He looked up at Daniel, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. I never knew she was pregnant. Daniel's expression shifted, suspicion mingling with a faint glimmer of hope. What are you saying? That you might be? John nodded, the weight of decades pressing down on him. It's possible. I left her, thinking I was doing what was best for us both. I thought I'd come back, but life, it got in the way. And I never knew. Daniel's jaw tightened as he absorbed the revelation. You just left? And you never came back? I was young, ambitious, and foolish, John admitted, his voice filled with regret. I thought I was building a life that would make everything better, but I see now what I lost in the process. The tension between them was palpable. Daniel's hands clenched at his sides as he wrestled with a lifetime of unanswered questions suddenly colliding with the present. Finally, he exhaled deeply, his shoulders relaxing slightly. I don't know what to think, Daniel said honestly, but I've spent my whole life wondering who my father was. If there's even a chance it's you, I think I need to know. John nodded, his voice firm despite the storm raging inside him. Then we'll find out. Together. The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur. Daniel agreed to a DNA test, and John arranged for everything to be expedited. As they waited for the results, they sat together in the office, their conversation tentative but meaningful. John shared stories of his youth, carefully choosing the memories that painted him as more than just the successful businessman he had become. He wanted Daniel to see the man he once was, the man who had loved Elena with everything he had. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Daniel's wariness began to thaw. He still had questions, still carried the weight of years without answers, but he couldn't deny the sincerity in John's eyes. When John left the garage that evening, he felt something he hadn't in years, a glimmer of hope. Whatever the test revealed, he knew one thing for certain. Meeting Daniel had changed him, and he was determined not to waste this second chance. The results came faster than either of them expected. John sat in the same small office at the garage, the envelope containing the DNA results resting on the desk between him and Daniel. The tension in the room was almost unbearable, both men locked in a silence heavy with anticipation. You open it, Daniel finally said, his voice quiet but firm. John hesitated, his hands trembling slightly as he picked up the envelope. He glanced at Daniel, whose jaw was set, his expression a mix of determination and vulnerability. Slowly, John tore it open, unfolding the crisp sheet of paper inside. His eyes scanned the results, and the truth hit him like a tidal wave. "It's positive," John said, his voice barely above a whisper. He looked up at Daniel, his blue eyes filled with a mix of awe and regret. "You're my son." Daniel's face remained unreadable for a moment, his emotions clearly warring beneath the surface. He leaned back against the desk, crossing his arms as he let out a slow, controlled breath. "So, it's true." "It is," John replied, his voice thick with emotion. "I can't change the past, Daniel, but I want to be here now. If you'll let me." Daniel didn't respond immediately. Instead, he turned to look out the window, his gaze fixed on the bustling street outside. "You left her," he said, his tone even but laced with a quiet pain. "You left my mother to raise me alone. How do I just accept that?" "I don't expect you to," John admitted, his voice soft but resolute. "I made mistakes, more than I can count, but I didn't know about you, Daniel. If I had, I would have been there." Daniel turned back to face him, his expression hard to read. "You can't just show up now and expect everything to fall into place." "I'm not asking for that," John replied. "All I'm asking for is a chance to know you, to make up for what I've missed, even if it's just a little." The words hung in the air between them, the weight of 30 years of absence pressing down on both men. Finally, Daniel sighed, running a hand through his dark, grease-slicked hair. "I don't know what to think. This is a lot to process." John nodded, understanding the gravity of the moment. "Take your time. I'll be here." Over the next few weeks, John made good on his promise. He visited the garage often, not just as a bystander, but as someone genuinely trying to be part of Daniel's life. He brought coffee in the mornings, listened to Daniel's stories about the customers he helped, and even rolled up his sleeves to assist with simple repairs. At first, Daniel remained guarded, but slowly, he began to let John in. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, Daniel approached John while he worked on a stubborn carburetor. "You know," Daniel said, his tone lighter than usual, "I used to wonder if I'd ever meet my father. I had this idea in my head of what he'd be like." John paused, looking up from the engine. "And do I measure up?" Daniel smirked, a glimmer of warmth breaking through his usual stoicism. "You're different, but I think that's a good thing." The weeks turned into months, and the relationship between father and son deepened. John learned that Daniel's passion for mechanics stemmed from Elena, who had taught him to cherish hard work and community. In return, Daniel began to see John not just as the man who had left, but as someone genuinely trying to make amends. One day, as they locked up the garage, Daniel handed John a small, grease-stained notebook. "This was my mom's," he said, his voice tinged with emotion. "She wrote everything in here. Her dreams, her thoughts, even recipes. I think she'd want you to have it." John took the notebook, his hands trembling as he opened it. The pages were filled with Elena's neat handwriting, her words painting a vivid picture of her love for their son and the life she had tried to build for him. Tears welled in John's eyes as he read, the weight of his absence hitting him anew. "I don't deserve this," he said quietly. "You do," Daniel replied firmly, "because you're here now. And that's what matters." The story didn't end with perfection. It wasn't a fairy tale. There were still moments of tension, of doubt, of unspoken pain. But there was also progress. John supported Daniel in expanding the garage, helping him turn it into a place where young people could learn the trade. In turn, Daniel helped John reconnect with a part of himself he had long buried. The part that valued people over power, connection over success. One evening, as they shared a quiet moment outside the garage, John looked at Daniel, his heart full. "Your mother would be proud of you," he said, "of the man you've become." Daniel smiled, his eyes glistening. "I think she'd be proud of you too." For the first time in years, John felt whole. He hadn't just found a son. He had found a reason to be better. And though their story was far from over, it was one worth building, one day at a time.